Hello. Today's leaked Treasury document in the Daily Telegraph makes truly depressing reading. It says that on the government's central scenario, it's going to have to borrow £337 billion this year alone. And that's against an expected borrowing target of £55 billion set in March. In the worst case, we end up borrowing £500 billion this year. And to put that in context, we've only ever borrowed £1.75 trillion ever. Now, predictably, this raises calls for austerity. The Treasury is talking about 30 billion cuts in the best case scenario, 90 billion a year in the worst case scenario. We, on the left, have to begin by saying no to any austerity. But it's not enough just to say that. If the Treasury is right and the predictions are anywhere close to accurate, this crisis is going to be as bad as the one that hit Britain in 1929-1930 and took down the Labour government. It took down the Labour government because Labour government couldn't handle what needed to be done. It was wedded to an old economic orthodoxy that was no longer relevant. Now, it's the Tories' misfortune that they're in power and that they are wedded to an old economic orthodoxy that is, quite frankly, just simply no longer relevant. But I think there's an opportunity here for us to try and forge a cross-party consensus around a new model for Britain's economy. For me, it comes down to 5 things. There are 5 steps we need to take, each one of which will do the heads in of orthodox policymakers and people in the Treasury. But here goes. The first is to accept permanent, mid-term, permanent high debt. So that is, Britain's debt looks likely to go up from 1.75 trillion to something like 2 trillion almost in a year. And it'll go beyond that. Rishi Sunak has already accepted the idea of a higher debt to GDP ratio. So it's currently about 75%. It looks like it's going towards 100%. It may have to go higher. I think that's the cornerstone. We say, let's stabilise Britain's debt at, say, 105, 110, 120% of GDP. If we did that, we'd be lucky, stabilising the debt. We'd actually be well within the range of other major countries. Japan, 250% of GDP already. America, rocketing sky high. Step 1, accept a new high normal in terms of debt to GDP. Step 2 is we have to overtly, consciously and enthusiastically monetize the debt. Now what that means is the Bank of England buys some of it and holds it forever. It makes no pretense that one day that debt will be sold back to pension funds and banks. We take government borrowing and we sterilise it. We call it monetisation in the form of a big dump called the Bank of England where that money sits forever. Now, yes, that is the state lending to itself, but it's doing so over time. It's like a bridging loan. And the bridging loan is coming to us from the Britons who will live in the back half of the 21st century when this problem will be sorted out. It won't be sorted out before, with magnitudes of borrowing in the 2020s revealed in the Treasury document. Now, step 3 is not just tax the rich. That's been the left's slogan. We can tax the rich. I think you could probably raise another 50 billion a year through the kind of tax measures that were proposed by John McDonnell. But it's not going to be enough. We have to begin the conversation about taxing wealth. That is not just taxing the incomes of rich people, but taxing all the speculative property that's being put up in South London where I live, all the speculative investments that are made by hedge funds and offshore finance companies, and above all, bringing the $32 trillion worth of offshore investments back on shore. Some of it could turn up here. We're a big economy. If we just taxed big corporations like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, etc., on their turnover in the UK, we could raise significant amounts of tax. Let's do that before we start raising corporation tax for hairdressers and raising income tax for already hard-pushed people who are going to see their wages cut. Step 4 is to reduce the liabilities of the government, which is borrowing so much, to lend to businesses. For every time it bails out a business, it needs to get an asset, because that asset can then sit on the government's balance sheet alongside the liability. What does that mean? If we bail out IAG, which owns British Airways, or Virgin, all the train companies, P&O, big hotel chains, maybe the automobile manufacturers, maybe the oil companies, we, the British public, get a stake in those companies. And we hold that stake, not in a way that, like the Brown government did, in a kind of hands-off way. We actively manage our stake in the private sector. It's a very different kind of capitalism, but it is not socialism. It is capitalism, and it can work. Fifth and finally, we need a state investment bank, a British investment bank that mobilises both public and private money to what? To invest in a new kind of economy, to invest in transport, to invest in education and skills, to invest in the public environment. We've never done this. Other countries do it. Again, it's, capitalist Norway does it, capitalist Finland. We can do this without having to rip up capitalism. In the 30s, the reason the left got into such a pickle about what to do was because it was led by people who could not believe that capitalism was reformable. That Ramsay MacDonald used to spout on about socialism, saying capitalism's failed, we need socialism, while presiding over a rise in unemployment because he said you can't do anything. We need to understand that the left's job here is to propose a radical new model of capitalism that's going to be transitional to something else, certainly transitional to a green, zero carbon economy, and hopefully transitional to a much more redistributive one and socially just one. If we follow these 5 points, I think it's possible certainly to build an opposition consensus around them, and even a cross-party one. But we've got to be brave, because standing against us is not just a set of bad ideas. The wealth of the super elite, the hedge fund guys, the offshore tax dodgers, all rests on us not doing this. And that's why they're going to come back to us for austerity. Let's understand what austerity will mean, because we've had 10 years of it. It will destroy the health service all over again. It will, in addition, flatline economic growth. Anybody who thinks you get out of a slump by cutting the spending of government when the private sector can't spend is crazy. All the evidence of the last slump showed that George Osborne spent 2 years flatlining the economy because of his obsession with austerity. And austerity kills people. And the sad thing is, what's happening right now before us, week by week, month by month, is that all the sacrifices we made for 10 years are being wiped out, along with all the economic growth of the last 10 years, wiped out. Yes, by a virus. It's not our fault. It's not, nobody in Britain invented the virus, nobody released it. But the virus is here. It must be sorted out. And what we need to do is to grasp the opportunity to move beyond a highly financialized, highly unequal economy where the free market dominates. We need to put the state back at the centre of things, because only the state stands between us and 500,000 people dying. Make no doubt about it. And have the courage to embrace something we haven't seen since the 1970s, a kind of capitalism that puts people first. I know it's a big ask, especially for Tories, but also for some Labour people, because I'm sure that some people were thinking, well, no, Starmer's here, we can go back to kind of old, boring Blairism, fiscal orthodoxy. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. And if Britain is the first out of the traps, as all countries have to consider this, if we're first out of the traps towards an investment-led, domestic demand-driven, and yes, high debt form of capitalism, my hunch is that we will be better off, because that's the lesson of the 30s. Because Britain dropped the old model in 1931, yes, under terrible pressure of a run on the pound and a mutiny in the Royal Navy, it didn't suffer fascism. It didn't suffer the kind of deep depression that the Americans did. It did eventually recover. That's the lesson of economic history, and I think I appeal to people across all parties to learn it now.